So you all decided to come and join me at the Weird Talk today. So this is the talk on digital assets. And before we jump in, could I get a quick show of hands for who works in finance today? Fantastic. Who works with digital assets as we're going to talk about them today? At least a few people. Let's hang out afterwards. Or those are the other people you want to speak with. Who owns some cryptocurrency or digital assets? Awesome. We've got about a third of the room, so you participated. You've got some skin in the game. And I'm going to talk about some of the lessons that I've learned. Over the last 3 years, up until a few months ago, I ran infrastructure and security at CoinBase, one of the largest companies in the space in the world. And one of the big themes and a lot of the work we did was how we're securing our assets. And I first jumped into the space about 3 years ago when I went from the government to work for Coinbase. And when we started to think about security there in our fintech space, I looked back a little bit for how security had worked for a longer period of time in finance. And traditionally, we don't see very many whole entire banks go out of business. We often saw financial instruments sharded based on the physical space that they could occupy. So we might see money loaded into a car if we go back enough in the world of finance. And you could only lose so much at any one point in time. And so we might see events like this happen every so often, or we would see bits and pieces of funds lost, but we didn't see funds lost at the rate we see them in more recent digital asset companies. This is a screencast of what our exchange at Coinbase looked like called GDAX, and money moves really quickly in this space. We can store an arbitrary amount of money in most crypto assets on just a few bytes of data stored in RAM, and that can move irreversibly, instantaneously across the world. And so we're leveling up the stakes in security just a bit when we're talking about how we're protecting the funds we're storing in a crypto world. So that led me to work at Coinbase, and over the 3 years that I was there, we built up quite a few new capabilities for our company. In the period I was there, we went from running in 1 country to about 32 countries. As of yesterday, we've got 8.1 million users, so this number is shooting up really rapidly now. Over the period I was there, we exchanged somewhere north of $6 billion, and we deployed hundreds of times per month to production. So we were still moving really fast, and as I'm sure all of you have seen, the space is still evolving really rapidly. Now, there's been a lot of renewed interest in the space over the last couple of months, and as much as I wish this was based on the fundamentals, I think a lot of what's driving some of the more modern interest in the space is you see how some of these assets have performed. And this talk is not going to be about investing or speculating. I'm just going to talk about the tech. But I think a lot of what's attracted this interest is you see Bitcoin up over 500% in the last 12 months. Right? That gets some eyeballs on it. That's why you see this on TV. Litecoin up even more, almost 700%. Charlie's done a really good job continuing to grow that. And the big one that I'm sure many of you are aware of is Ethereum, up 54,000%. So I'm not going to ask you to raise hands, but if anybody here has done well on Ethereum, drinks are on you afterwards. If you want to invite everyone else out, we'll follow. What I think is further making the space exciting now is these were all their own cryptocurrencies. These are their own blockchains that took a long period to bootstrap and build a whole network around. But what's happening now is Ethereum, as a Turing-complete cryptocurrency that allows you to deploy smart contracts upon it, has provided new standards for you to launch new assets on top of the Ethereum blockchain. And so this is a snapshot from a site called ICO Alert that shows some of the new upcoming or recently published initial coin offerings you might have heard of, and many of these are built on the Ethereum blockchain as a simple, small, smart contract. This might be a couple hundred lines of code at most, and this allows people to very easily and much more inexpensively bootstrap new cryptocurrencies. Now, what these look like, many of them are compatible, certainly not all, but many of these are built by being compatible with the ERC20 interface, which is a set of functions and events that you can mirror today. If you launch a contract or write a small piece of code, this piece of code can look like a small piece of Python written in a language called Solidity that written in a language called Serpent that compiles down to the Ethereum virtual machine, or another language called Solidity, which compiles down to, or which looks like a JavaScript-like language that compiles also down to the Ethereum virtual machine. This is a snapshot of Solidity here, and you can mirror this to implement your own token on the Ethereum blockchain. You could get something up and running in probably a couple hours worth of time rather than the weeks or months plus the compute power it would take. And this leverages the network and a lot of the security that Ethereum already brings. And that security it brings is at the protocol or network layer, not at the application layer or verifying the goodness of the contract you've written. So this is what is lowering the bar to the initial coin offering. We've seen some really large ones recently. Some of the interesting new currencies that are being built on top of Ethereum are things like Augur, which builds a prediction market and brings its own rep token built in an ERC20-like interface, not exactly that. This is one of the early ones. And this provides a prediction market to use the reputation that you build up over time in this contract to ascertain the goodness of future predictions you'll make. I think this is a really interesting project. Or another one that's come out recently called Golem. Golem is known as the worldwide supercomputer, and this uses another token-like interface to allow you to exchange and bid on compute resources, which you can expose through a blockchain. And these are all done in a fully distributed, trustless, globally incentivized community, which I think is incredible that this can be built on top of an open, censor-resistant network for one of the first times. Looking at some of the other funding from the other side of this that's been coming into the space, if you look at venture investments, and this comes from Nick Tomeno at his site, The Control, he took a look at where traditional venture funding is coming into crypto companies over the last 12 months. And there's about $140 million in venture capital that's been poured into the space. But in funds that have been raised through things like the initial coin offering, where new tokens are being launched and raising new funds on the blockchain through other exchanges where you can exchange USD or Bitcoin or Ethereum for these tokens, over $300 million has been brought into the space in the last 12 months. So this is now more than traditional venture investing, and we're starting to see this community bootstrapping itself. Now, just so we're absolutely clear though, this talk, again, is not about any of the financial fundamentals of the space. So every time this comes up, there's always someone who has a strong reason for why you shouldn't invest in Ethereum. If anybody has something that they really want to get off their chest, why don't we take a couple seconds? Feel free to shout it out, why people shouldn't be putting money into the space. Right, so things like this is speculative, the risk is through the roof, we don't have formal verification of contracts, we've seen lots of scams, we've seen crypto historically will be broken at some point when new breakthroughs in mathematics come through. So again, this talk is really only about the tech. If you have any complaints, please direct them to the CEO of these distributed networks. So I think where we're at is much more akin to what the internet looked like in 1996. Okay? There were a lot of great ideas coming out. There were a lot of new projects. But when we look back from where we are today, with hindsight being 2020, we can see a lot of these projects have faded away or been merged or acquired. And so only a couple of the projects we saw in 1996 are still a part of our lives today. And I think this is really true to where we are in the crypto space right now. There are a lot of great ideas that I think will inspire great things that come ahead, but I'll be surprised if many of the tools we're using and excited about today last for the next 15 or 20 years. So the thesis of this talk then is, like TCP/IP, digital assets, which are now accelerating through the initial coin offering, where the barrier to launching strong protocols is lowering and lowering, are extremely powerful open networks, and I'm excited to see what gets built on top of them. I think like finance, where we're now storing value, real hard, dense digital value on these tokens, these naturally bring attackers that want to take that money. People would like generally money around the world. It's one of the universal things that brings us all together, for better or for worse. And if we're going to work in a world where we're now storing millions or billions of dollars on our servers, we need to take security extremely seriously. And lastly, unlike before, This is no longer an internet where we have information that we can freely copy and move around and we can take a snapshot or a backup of that we can recover. These are funds that can instantaneously, irreversibly move across the world. And the cost of a single breach, as we've seen many, many times over the last few years, can lead to the end of your enterprise. And I would love to see more people in this room building great new ideas on top of one of these blockchains or helping to further the community we're in here. But I also don't want to see your ideas taken over because of a simple security mistake. And to start with, I think it helps to look back on where some of these mistakes have really taken hold and what this has looked like over the last couple of years. I'm sure everyone in this room has probably seen what happened with one of the biggest, Mt. Gox. This was in 2013, where there was an internal breach that led to a loss of over 800,000 Bitcoin. At the time, about $600 million. We've since seen a lot of other compromises in the space, many of which have led to the complete overnight loss of what would have otherwise been a large enterprise. So security has really been hitting this space hard, and these breaches have not slowed down like I would have hoped they would. We've seen over 40 digital asset companies over the last 3 years be completely wiped out due to a security breach of some kind. And there's been a project that has started to catalog these breaches. Mr. Magoo, or Ryan McGeehan, has a great project called the Blockchain Graveyard, where every time there's a new Bitcoin company that gets popped or winds up in the graveyard, he catalogs them here and roughly indicates how they were compromised and puts them into a different bar here. And you can see the primary breach that's led to these losses are traditional server breach. Application vulnerabilities are not new to anyone else in finance here. Insider risk has started to become a much larger threat in this space, and we're going to talk a little bit about that. To take a quick tour on what these have looked like, for one of my favorite breaches, in a bit of a dystopian sense, or one of the most interesting with our security hats on, we've seen really determined attackers in the space, not just looking for a vulnerability, but actually building up a relationship with employees at a company to gain their trust so that they could exploit it. We saw one compromise that started with an invitation to participate in a professional event. This looks something like inviting them to speak at a conference, right? Something that seems like a great thing to do. I certainly enjoy sharing ideas. I think we're all on that same page. But this precipitated a series of building up a relationship, leading to a point where a malicious Word document was sent to an employee that contained some malware inside of it. That dropped a malicious binary on their machine, and they then took several months from there to pivot through their environment, learn how to get to their production network, and ultimately breach their production servers, leading to a loss of millions of dollars in Bitcoin. This is a breach that someone spent about 8 months working through, and in those 8 months, this person left with several million dollars. So their return on investment here for an 8-month spear phishing campaign was probably far beyond most of our salaries in this room. So these attackers are doing better than a lot of us here. Okay. One of the other large breaches that we alluded to before, one of the pieces that precipitated that was an insider that was malicious. This insider spent many months manipulating internal records that allowed them to slowly bleed out finances from inside the company, leading to a loss of over 800,000 Bitcoin. When this was first leaked, or when this was discovered, this was somewhere north of $600 million. But at today's exchange rate, this is now a multi-billion-dollar breach. Right? We don't see this very often in traditional finance, but this is becoming commonplace, unfortunately, in the crypto world. Now, one of my all-time favorite, most interesting security events that has occurred in the space, I sort of hope we don't see anything this interesting for the next couple of years, was the Distributed Autonomous Organization, or the DAO. And could I get a quick show of hands for anyone that knows what the DAO is or what happened there? Okay, just a couple of people. The quick story on this is the DAO was a really ambitious idea on the Ethereum blockchain. This was one of the earlier token-like assets. And the DAO was a way for people to send money into a smart contract on the Ethereum blockchain. In turn for the money they had sent in, they received voting rights for the pool of money that had been collected, with the idea being that people could democratically vote on how these funds were redistributed to make venture-like investments in other crypto companies. Over a period of several months, over $100 million was raised by the smart contract, again, with no single centralized party that owned this contract. This was all built on this fully distributed, decentralized, trustless network. And this included some methods inside of the smart contract. Again, we're looking at Solidity here, that allowed you to vote. And from this vote, you could then redistribute shares with certain constraints around quorum and what it meant to unlock those funds that could be sent to another Ethereum address. Well, it turned out if we scroll a little bit further down this contract, there were some other ideas in here that allowed you to take money out of this contract and move it to another DAO-like contract. So you could split that DAO. And the code that was written, even though this was only a few hundred lines of JavaScript-like code, there were some quirks in here. One of the quirks was in the function here, withdraw reward for, you had the ability to pay out. And if you look inside the payout function, you had the ability to call another arbitrary function. And someone really clever realized that you could chain these together, and in that arbitrary function, you could pay out again. And this allowed someone to start chaining these together to recursively call a withdraw reward for to pay out, to go back around to call payout again, and back around, and you can see where this is going. And they were able to pay out multiple times. And this was interesting because this was happening before the debit actually occurred on the paid out variable there. So what this allowed someone to do was drain the DAO. This is where there were over $100 million raised. So the brief timeline on what this looked like was at the end of May, the crowdfunding happened. This is where about $150 million at that current exchange rate was raised. On June 8th, there was a proposal submitted to the DAO that was used to later initiate this recursive exploit. A few days later, someone in the community, one of the core developers, realized that this type of vulnerability was possible, and someone even looked at the DAO and said, hey, this looks like that vulnerability, but the conclusion was incorrectly made that the DAO was not vulnerable, while some attacker out there that could see this trustless distributed network realized it actually was. A few days later, the attacker, who had put quite a bit of money inside of the DAO, voted to fund or initiate that proposal. And 2 days later, 3.6 million Ethereum, or 3.6 million Ether, were drained from this contract. At that rate, it was worth about $77 million at the time. In today's exchange rate, now that Ethereum has gone up this 54,000% over the last 12 months, this is over $1 billion attack. Right? These attacks have to stop if we're going to think seriously about the world using more of these digital assets. But what happened after this was incredible. So later that day, the Ethereum founder, Vitalik Buterin, one of the very strong presences in the community, proposed to freeze those funds. And again, this is a trustless distributed network. He does not own this. He does not have full control over the Ethereum network, but he does have a lot of influence. And in the very wise words of Charlie Lee, the Litecoin founder, we were talking about this the day of to figure out what we were going to do as a company with this. And in Charlie's words, we were going to find out what it meant to be a truly decentralized currency. With the question being, are we going to let this attacker, or will this attacker be able to get away with all these funds, or is there anything we can do? So what the Ethereum group did was later that day, they issued a soft fork for the Ethereum mining code that froze the funds in that account. And one of the ideas that came after this was they were planning on reversing the transaction, and consider a lot of the early Ethereum developers had put a lot of money into the DAO too. So they were certainly incentivized to get their money back too. So the first thing that happened was they froze those funds. This was relatively uncontroversial, and this started to roll out. And the next thing that happened was a change started to roll out. And this rolls out by nature of a proposal or a software update being made, and the Ethereum developers requesting that miners start upgrading to this new piece of software that would freeze funds. And they cannot force this, but they can certainly strongly request it. And what an upgrade like this normally looks like is there is a pool of miners running some version of the Ethereum mining software, and they're all running on the same network. So they're one roughly homogeneous network. When a new version of the software is proposed, we slowly start to see new miners run this new version of the software, but it's still compatible with the old version. And how these normally conclude is miners will fully move over to this new software, will continue updating, and will all continue to be one Ethereum or one cryptocurrency. But what actually happened was fascinating. People running the old version of the Ethereum mining software, where the stolen funds were not reversed, where the attacker still had access to them and he could still move them about freely. Some people strongly believed in Ethereum not censoring this person's transactions, and so people kept running the old version of the mining software and not contributing to this new world where those funds were reversed. And so what this meant was we now had two versions of Ethereum. There was an Ethereum world where those funds were frozen and then reversed, and there was a old world where those funds were stolen and still free to move about. And what happened after this in the financial markets for digital assets, this is a snapshot of Poloniex. They later that week listed Ethereum Classic as a wholly separate currency that you could buy and sell and exchange. And what came of this was two new currencies. And I've never seen this happen in a traditional financial market before, where there's one currency that splits into two, and both of those retain value. And if you held money before the fork, you had a little bit of each fund on the other side. And so there are some really interesting properties that are coming about in the space. From there were replay attacks that happened after this, something we see a lot in theory, we don't see as much in practice, and we saw two new currencies come about. This took us a long time to figure out how to properly credit our customers, and was a completely unplanned event for us. So I really believe that digital assets are introducing brand new security challenges in a way at a scale that we haven't seen before. So I'm now going to walk through some of the lessons I learned in my 3 years at CoinBase for how we protected our assets, and how I think new digital asset projects can think about effectively securing what they have. So the first 6 things I'm going to run through are here. The first big point that I think we all need to grapple with is dealing with the humans in our network. So I totally get the value of cryptography and strong protocols and formally verifying the cryptographic transactions that are happening. But any time we're working on a crypto project that's going to matter, there will be people that need to use it. And if people are interacting with your protocol, they need to be a part of your security model too. Now, traditionally, how we think about securing a system with humans, we can take a few approaches, right? We can put more visibility into our network. We can watch our people. We can watch what they do. And I think this works for a variety of applications. But when you can digitally access millions or billions of dollars and instantly move them, the best you can hope for in some of these scenarios is watching your money move out from underneath you. So I think this is not always the right way to solve the human problem in a crypto market. The next thing we can think about doing is building more sophisticated security modeling and bringing more analytics into our network, so we can look at when something roughly anomalous has occurred. But again, this is typically looking at after the fact, when an action has occurred, can we ascertain the goodness of that transaction? And this may, again, only help us see when funds have left our network. So I think it's worth taking a step back and thinking about how we secure really sensitive assets that we don't want in the hands of any one individual. And something that we modeled our program after was how the nuclear codes and our nuclear warheads are protected in the US. And for how these, what I think, extremely secure assets are protected, whenever you see the president moving about, he'll always be followed by a military personnel carrying what's called the nuclear football, or carrying this a satchel. That carrier will be walking around with this always by the president. Now, the president will then have the gold codes inside of his person. And this is especially interesting when there's a president that some of you may or may not want to have these nuclear codes. There's been a lot of politicizing around the dangers of this, but depending on who's president, there's always someone that's afraid of it. For him to activate these nuclear codes, there's a message that's then sent through the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and they can elect to continue that forward onto a dual-person system in any nuclear warhead that will actually fire that missile. So there is no single person in this chain that has the ability to wake up on the wrong side of the bed, God forbid, fall into some state of mental illness or have some other problem that doesn't allow them to think clearly about this asset that we really want to protect. So I think that real value is protected by consensus, right? We cannot have any single person with access to millions or billions of dollars in our network that can instantly run away with that. In a world where we're seeing these highly targeted and sustained phishing attacks, we're building up relationships so that we can implant malware on servers inside of our environment, we still need to consider that administrators also count as single point failures. It is not safe for me or you or the founder of some large digital asset company to have full access to your network. And so the solution that we invested so heavily in at CoinBase was building out the three-phase consensus model. Now, we want to balance this with productivity for our staff. We want people to feel like they can have a big impact in any part of our environment. So we want to make sure anyone inside of our world can propose any change that they would want. If they want to change a piece of software, if they want to change part of our network, a part of how the company is working, they should be empowered to propose any change they want in a codified manner. Once that proposal has been made, however, we want to separate the achieving consensus from them. And once consensus from multiple parties has been achieved, we want to finish with an application stage. And one of the tools that I'm sure many of you are using that I think implements this really well is the DVCS tool Git. And with how this is implemented, especially GitHub with the pull request model, we can really easily tie in a propose, apply consensus, and then apply the changes that have been proposed across any of your environments. So what this looked like for us was a bot that we used inside of GitHub that was integrated with some of our other internal tooling that allowed anyone to open up a pull request. You can propose any codified change across our environment. Once that proposal is made, there's a bot that says, hey, this looks great, but before we allow you to merge this or before we allow this change to propagate through the rest of any of our systems, we're going to need multiple other authorized parties to approve this. And only once we've gotten the appropriate amount of +1s or LGTM saying it looks good to me, will we allow this to be merged to the master branch. It's the bot and the monitoring and the signatures that we have on this that would then allow this commit to be deployed or propagate through any other parts of our environment. And that's when it could be applied for the third phase of consensus. So here we have this model where we have two people turning their keys. We've now removed any single point of failure, but made our staff feel empowered that they can make any change inside of our environment and still move fast. Now, there are other places where we can apply this model, so we've extended this to other development tooling. This is a tool called CodeFlow. This is a project that we were working hard on open sourcing. I hope to see this open source in the next few months. This is where we managed all of our deployments. And so we would accept in this stage a Docker Compose YAML file that defined how we wanted to launch and manage our containers. So we, again, wanted all of our staff to propose or make any changes to really have an impact on our environment. But before you could make a change, when you would click the Save button here, this would say, this is great. We're now going to treat this as a proposed change set. This isn't live in production yet. And we'd force some independent party to look at the change set proposal, and they would be able to approve this. So again, anyone can propose. We need multiple people to apply. We're again turning the keys. This is something you can also apply into the products that you're developing. So this is something we'd expose publicly. Rather than us holding on to all of our crypto keys for our customers, we'd also exposed a multi-party system through our Vault tool that provided 3 keys. One key that Coinbase controlled, one key that we held the encrypted bundle for, but you held a password for that you could remember, and a third piece of crypto material that you downloaded and you stored on some safe box. And any 2 of those 3 shards could come together to unlock the funds that you were storing. That provided resiliency in the case of total compromise. You would still have access to your funds, or if we were completely offline, you could still have your funds. There was no single shard that could take them away. And this again allowed any two of 3 of those components to unlock your funds. The last piece I want to mention where we applied this in some of our really sensitive crypto environments was using M-event cryptography, or Shamir secret sharing. This allowed us to create a set number of shards n and set a threshold where any m of those shards could unlock them. So very similar to that last 2 or 3 application, this is something we were able to generalize to where we stored our hot wallet and more of our keys. One tool that implements this publicly, I think, quite well is Vault. This is a crypto tool that's come out of HashiCorp, and what you can do with Vault is when you initialize the Vault, and this is a place where you can store key material, you set the m and n thresholds on what are needed to unlock this vault for future operations. So what we're doing here is saying there are 3 key shares, that's the n in this case, and the threshold is 2. So when this vault is sealed, we cannot unlock it unless the m of those n have come together to sign it. And when you first create the vault, these are the 3 shards that are being exposed here. They're also now integrated with Keybase if you want to encrypt these directly to a PGP bundle and send these out so you don't need everyone in the same place in a secure machine. From these 3 shards, when we want to later unlock the vault, if we look at a vault status here, it'll say the vault is currently sealed, and we need at least 2 keys to unlock it. We can then paste one of our keys into the vault, and you can do this over a network connection, so you don't need everyone to be in the same room. And you can see the vault is still sealed here. And after a second key is pasted into the vault, we'll have achieved quorum. This will unlock the vault. And again, this is now turning 2 of those 3 keys to unlock this bundle that has more secret material inside. And they're using Shamir secret sharing here as well that allow us to rely on Shamir's perfect secrecy properties, which has been well researched and something we've relied on quite a bit. So the first big lesson here is to remove human single point failures and use this idea of consensus engineering to move fast. Without this, I think it's very easy to move cripplingly slow, or security can easily become a blocker inside of your environment. The second lesson I want to talk about is secure foundations. This is, I think, one of the easier things we can do that's often overlooked. And a great stat that precipitated this for me was reading the Verizon data breach investigation report in 2015. And in the 2015 GBIR, where they look at thousands of real world breaches to see how companies are getting owned in the real world. And what they found was 99.9% of the compromises they were seeing, so the vast majority of them, were seeing companies compromised because there was a vulnerability that they were running in production with a publicly available exploit that had been made available with a patch for over a year. Right? So they're being compromised in a way that they really don't have to. And this is not just some foreign company. These are the places that we all work. These are things that we are all messing up across the industry. And this is a place that I think we can really improve. I think this is especially important when you think about if you can't update or upgrade or keep our servers patched and we don't have a strong foundation, it doesn't matter what we build on top of that. We are going to get compromised. So really focusing on the foundation before we build higher up at all is critically important. And one of the things we did to reinforce this was by implementing what we called our 30-day plan. And what the 30-day plan said was that no servers inside of our cloud environment were allowed to live for more than 30 days. We were constantly rebuilding all of our VMs inside of our environment. This is a snapshot, one of the KPIs that we tracked well, looking at the median age of all the servers inside of our environment. It was typically around 24 hours. In this snapshot, we're somewhere between 2 and about 9 days for the median age of a VM living inside of our AWS environment in this place. And this was a metric we shared loud and proud in a lot of our internal tooling. So developers would see this regularly, service owners, project owners, org owners would see this. And we would track different percentiles. So we would look at where we're starting to close in on our 30-day limit. One of the things we did that helped us from how we'd architected our network was by only running mutually trusted containers together. One of the early design choices that we made was to run with Docker containers inside of our environment, but we weren't yet ready to trust isolation between our containers. For those of you that are able to make our security track on Thursday, that's run by Diogo, the head of security at Docker. So we can talk to him about the progress they're making, and they're doing some really good things there. But what we did was we then only ran these containers separated by a hypervisor inside of AWS, all in their own auto-scaling groups. And so we would separate across the different services we ran. So we would run web and API and admin and our data tiers all in different auto-scaling groups, and we wouldn't cross-pollinate on the machines we ran. So every time we deployed with a blue-green deployment, we would bring up new VMs, and we would tear down all of our old VMs, so we'd always come up fresh. And we could really easily roll our whole entire environment in just a couple of hours with this. So whenever a deploy rolled out, this is a snapshot of the AWS auto-scaling screen. It would look something like this, where you'd see all of the new boxes that had come up healthy, and we've torn down all of our old machines. So constantly redeploying. And this is really important because reconfiguration is rarely deterministic. For those of you that are logging into machines and updating and upgrading and changing and migrating packages, those are rarely processes that you can be completely sure about what your end state will look like, and you easily see configuration drift. Right? How many people have ever seen a system administrator make some small change in a box just because it was more helpful for their workflow, and that has some downstream changes? That's the kind of thing that makes it really hard for us. So by constantly rebuilding, that's the best way we've found to keep a clean environment. So do not reconfigure, rebuild your environments, constantly update, upgrade, patch, and be very clear on what you're running inside. I think it's also important that this has to be an implementation detail of your infrastructure. This is not a level of complexity that you want to expose to the rest of your engineering staff. This is something that needs to be fully abstracted so you can continue to focus on your product, not about how your infrastructure is designed. So this is something we abstracted through our deployment tool, again, called CodeFlow. So that brings us to the second lesson, to deterministically update, upgrade, and fully understand your environment. And said differently, don't be the lowest hanging fruit. If everybody except this guy is updating their environment, and we're all running digital asset companies with millions of dollars on our servers, you can bet who's going to be the one that the determined attacker will want to spend their time on. So don't be the lowest hanging fruit. The third piece is to design for change. So we spoke a little bit about how the internet has changed over the last 20 years, or even over the last 2 or 3 years. You can see dramatic changes in what's happening in the internet. And I think we're seeing a very similar pace, if not faster, in this world of digital assets, where we're still seeing great new ideas and also large failures. So the industry is evolving really quickly. Where security typically takes a large role in many enterprises, I think it often starts to feel like what the CIA had proposed in their field sabotage manual. So for those of you that have seen this, there are some great quotes, and this is something like a 50-page manual for if you find yourself in time of war on the other side of the line and you want to sabotage an enterprise. They have all sorts of great tips for that. Things like making sure you always have 3 people that need to approve something for all of the cases, even when that's not really necessary. Or to make sure people are taking extra caution for things where they might not really need to apply it, and to have as many committees as possible. And I've spent some time working in the government, and this rings true for how I think that starts to feel over time. And it's really important if we are going to survive in the crypto work we're doing. We cannot move this slow today, or the only thing we can be sure about is we will not survive for the next 5 or 10 years when we really want to see the space grow. So what I think we instead want is we want to create a world where we can evolve really quickly. So you've all seen this. One of the ideas that I think ties this evolutionary and economic world together well for me is from this person named Joseph Schumpeter, who was an earlier economist. And he looked at capitalism and thought that it could only evolve through the idea of creative destruction. So rather than incrementally evolving, he sees capitalism evolving through new enterprises, new companies, new products, destroying things that have existed before us. And for some of the larger, more successful enterprises, I think we can see that. We can see them launching new products that cannibalize some of the things that they've run before them. This is something we spoke about when GDAX launched, where we saw that cannibalizing a little bit of CoinBase, but that ultimately became a really good decision for us long term. Over the 3 years that I worked there, when I started, there were a lot of players in the space, many of which were not there by the time I left. Very few of these companies survived. And what I think is really interesting too is a lot of the companies on this board here have had a major security event, but they've still survived that. So security does not need to be an absolute thing. Do not let it strangle your company. You may see some security risk, and that can be an okay thing. You can survive as long as that risk is well managed. What that evolution looked like for us is starting with a company where our original goal was to make Bitcoin easy. We then realized that security was important, so we focused on making Bitcoin safe and easy. We then pivoted again to become a Bitcoin wallet. And I'm just showing snapshots of our homepage here, but there were a lot of internal changes that happened behind the scenes. Over this period, we're growing from one monolithic service to about 100 services inside. We then launched this whole new product line called GDAX, which is our institutional exchange. And we then started to grow rapidly, now up to about 8.1 million users. If you refresh this page at the end of the week, you might see 8.2 or 8.3. So they're growing faster than they ever have today. And this takes us through the cycle of moving really quickly with a high degree of confidence so that we can evolve, so that we can survive. And one of the first things that starts to stand in the way of that is rigidity. And rigidity, to me, takes the form of security policies that don't allow people to adapt, or security policies were designed that start to look like snowflakes, where this has been someone's opinion, someone has said something, they haven't really written it down in a place that other people can see it, so you start to inject more humans in the process, right? And that starts to bring this fear of change. And anytime you're afraid of changing or redeploying or radically redesigning your service because you're not really sure the implications of that, that is something that, to me, needs to be addressed head on. So something we did to tackle this directly was to codify and automate everything, discouraging wherever possible written security policy or things that would require people to manually walk through more process. So we used a lot of besides codifying our applications, which are naturally why we're all at a software development conference, also codifying our infrastructure was really important for us. That allowed us to codify things like our firewall rules or some of our security policy. Here we're using AWS CloudWatch events, or you can tie this to AWS config. You want to codify AWS CloudTrail being turned on so that your security policy is fully codified and people can trace back to comments and source code for how things are created and configured. One of the tools we created on top of this is now open source called GeoEngineer that allows us to validate our Terraform configs by ingesting this into a Ruby DSL that helped us move a little bit faster. And so in the last 12 months that I was there, we used some of this automation to launch almost 150,000 servers in our environment. We deployed 13,000 times this year with a relatively small engineering team, and we created 45 new services. This I'm especially proud of, where all of the traditional security reviews and the slog that it would typically take to get new services out the door, we were able to accelerate quite a bit. And we did this while we were exchanging now up to and well over $100 million a day through our infrastructure. I'm very proud of that. The other side of this that I think is necessary to drive and make sure you're evolving in the right ways is defining the right SLIs and really looking at the metrics that define what you're trying to achieve. So we spent a lot of time on making sure we were measuring the right things and measuring them in places through tools like Kibana here using the Elk stack that everyone on the team could see, and they could trace back down in the query, and they could kind of start to tweak it or explore the data if they wanted to learn more about it. And for those of you that haven't seen these before, the service level indicator is a metric that you're collecting, but the service level objective is the measure or the bar you want to hit. And what helped us make sure we kept a high degree of quality and we removed that rigidity from our environment was by monitoring this bar, and whenever we fell below the level we wanted to meet, we would spend time to fix our quality before shipping new services. So we constantly improved what we were creating. So I think it's really important to set ambitious goals, set ambitious SLOs. Just like the product team gets to celebrate when a new public-facing product ships, a lot of this work can start to feel a lot less glamorous when you're talking about updating and upgrading and patching. So we set really ambitious goals for how do we update all of our servers within 24 hours, or how do we roll our whole environment in a 24-hour period too, so that we can have the same kind of product celebrations when we launch new parts or of our security program inside of the team. So for lesson 3, design for fast change. Assume everything you're building now will be fully out of date or deprecated in the next couple of years. And with that assumption, codify, automate, and make sure your team is prepared to go through those changes. The fourth lesson here is tiered storage. So in how we're storing data in a traditional web app, we often have 2 or 3 tiers, where we have our application tier and we might have our data tier behind it. And this works fine and good when we have multiple levels of protection, but we still have all sorts of security 0 days like Ghost or WannaCry recently, Image Magic or Image Tragic or Heartbleed that will lead to or the possibility of compromise for some of these assets. So we have to think about storing the crypto funds that we have in a world that's not fully dependent on our online systems. So the 3 tiers that we designed around were hot, warm, and cold storage for all of our crypto assets. And for the first tier, for how we were storing our hot funds, this looks something like a separate, very locked down, very well protected server with a very low attack surface area that was storing the minimum amount of funds that we needed for our daily operations. And some of the traits of a good hot storage system are having the minimum necessary operational funds. As long as your company is still growing, you probably don't need all of your customer assets on the funds at all time. So this for us was roughly about 0.1% of our funds. These services should be operated separately, and you should intentionally evolve slowly here. We want to introduce as little risk to our hot storage tiers as possible. We want to be resilient to an application compromise. We invested more here in pen testing and professional security reviews. Because this is then such a small amount of funds, these funds can be insured, and that allowed us to have a good hot wallet tier. For the next tier, for our warm tier, this looks somewhat similar to hot, except our funds are not always connected to the internet. We can easily and quickly connect them, but they're not natively connected. And this can look something like a Trezor wallet, something that you can store in a safe in the office, or you can store in a protected place, and you can plug in when you need it, but you are protected from any more sophisticated compromise. And some of the traits of a good warm storage system are funds that you need for infrequent events. This might be every month or once a quarter you need to access these funds. This should be disconnected and not online, but easily connected, and also physically protected. Again, so there's no single human point of failure. The last tier for cold storage comes from an interesting property for most of the crypto assets we work with, where rather than storing a symmetric password where we need that password to access our funds, we're using asymmetric crypto keys that have a public key and a private key. And the public key can be exposed and shared widely, just like PGP, so that anyone can encrypt or send funds to your public address, but you need your private key to send those funds. And so building on top of that, we can keep our cold storage completely offline, but still make our public keys accessible so we can sweep funds to our public keys when we need to. And these are some of the traits of a good cold storage system, and I've worked on a few of these. This is where the rare event fund should live, so the vast majority. These should be generated and accessed completely offline, so never touching a server that's online at all, reducing risk as much as possible. These should easily accept new funds through that asymmetric property. These need to be offline with a loud process, so when people are using it, when funds are being accessed, we want to notify as many people as possible so we have time to physically intervene if there's anything more malicious happening. And also implementing a double-blind M-event protection. So this would also use something like Shamir's. However, we don't want shard holders to know who other shard holders are to protect against things like collusion. So there were a couple snapshots we shared of one of our cold storage generation procedures. If you zoom in on this paper, you're not going to see any real data. These were then broken into printed pieces of paper that are resilient to any electromagnetic event, also on flash keys freeze of access, and stored in safe deposit boxes around the world. So lesson 4 being to keep the majority of your funds offline so that the rest of your security program is only looking at that 0.1%, which is insured in case of any larger catastrophe. The 5th lesson I want to point out is disaster recovery. So has anybody ever seen this on one of their machines? Okay. Great. So this is a snapshot of CryptoLocker. You never want to see this. This is a sign that your data has been encrypted and someone's trying to ransom you, probably for Bitcoin, to get access to your data again. So one of the things that we spend a lot of time with is thinking about how do we recover when there are other exploits or things that may have been sent to our network. And so when someone in your environment comes to you and says, hey, we think there might be a compromise, we think we found a vulnerability, it immediately introduces that risk that someone has injected something bad into your environment. So when you've been hit with a new exploit and you're not sure if you can trust your data, if you even still have access, you have to ask yourself the question of when are you ready to come back online? And this can be a really hard question to answer. So one of the things we did was making sure we had many-to-one cloud accounts, and this is one tier of our disaster recovery. So as your cloud accounts start to grow, make sure you have one place with keys that are stored entirely offline that has snapshots for all of your backups stored, and you can use hardware tokens so you can physically protect access to these environments again. And we went through several what we called scorched earth exercises where we pretended that there was a big compromise in our environment, and we used all the security automation I'd mentioned before to rebuild that environment, and we used well-defined metrics and very public dashboards to watch us burn down. And the last lesson I'm going to talk about is battle testing. So we've done all this work. We now want to make sure, are we really ready to survive through a compromise? So one thing we did was having a very public bug bounty program. We spent hundreds of thousands of dollars encouraging white hats to submit vulnerabilities to us. And you're starting to see these grow throughout the rest of the crypto ecosystem. And the last thing we did was we ran tests. So we only know that we're as prepared as the testing that we've gone through as a team. And so this took the form of several red teaming exercises internally where we would simulate real compromises, let the team know roughly a time frame when these red teams would occur. And some of these looked like some of our alerts or messages starting to fire, the team starting to respond in real time, looking at what these events look like, and having pretty detailed simulations for to make the team feel like we were actually going through something malicious. This was an actual message we sent to the team during one of them requesting a $5 million ransom to get our data back, but the team instead was able to work through some of the tools we'd put in place. And it's so important that when we're going through these testing, these tests, these look and feel like a success for your team. So when these tests occur, I think they need to feel something like this. Let's see if the sound works.
Be the worst disaster NASA's ever experienced. With all due respect, sir, I believe this is going to be our finest hour.
All right, so some of you have probably seen Apollo 13. When things get bad, this is something they prepared for. This is something they turn into a win for the team. And these were things we were able to celebrate as an organization. We always turned these into a party at the end. We always brought the team together through these. And the last lesson before we close is for all of these things, ultimately you need to do what fits for your organization. I've seen small startups focused on really complex zero-day nation-state protection before they've even found product market fit. And the security can easily slow you down to the point where you can't ship a product and you never survive. So you really have to take a critical look at doing what fits. Make sure you build a product before you focus on building out a whole security organization. So to recap, I think digital assets are accelerating faster than ever before. I think these novel assets need securing. Most of these will evolve significantly, and for the security you apply it judiciously. I'm happy to hang around and chat for a little while after. Thank you so much for participating.